This is Christopher Young, and this is my podcast, Gotham and the Sacred. We live in a strange moment. By almost every measure, belief in God remains widespread. Churches still stand, sacred language still circulates. Moral claims are made constantly. And yet, something has collapsed. Not belief, but authority. Not faith, but function. This is Gotham and the Sacred. This is a podcast about philosophy, theology, ethics, and government, and about what happens when the sacred survives only as sentiment, but no longer orders our lives, restrains our power, or binds us one to another. This season, we explore a condition we call functional fatality, a world in which God is still spoken of, but no longer obeyed. God is invoked, but not feared, consumed, but not authoritative. We will ask uncomfortable questions. Can democracy survive without moral limits it did not create? Does capitalism depend on virtues it quietly erodes? Why do institutions fail when belief remains strong? And what replaces the sacred when it no longer binds? This is not a podcast about nostalgia or history. It is not a cultural war, and it is not easy answers. It is a serious conversation for a serious age. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred. Today's episode 5, The Early Modern Moral Break, Peace at the Price of Authority. Today's episode is on the heels of last week's episode and those that preceded it, as it relates to the break of God's authority or the sacred's authority post the advent of morality. And so here we go. Alasdair MacIntyre, who is a philosopher, I believe out of the University of Notre Dame, he writes in his book, or he provides a hypothetical in his book, After Virtue. It goes like this. He says, imagine a world where the natural sciences suffered a catastrophe. Laboratories were destroyed, scientific instruments vanished, books and journals burned. The institutions that once sustained scientific inquiry collapsed. A few fragments of science survived. Isolated pages, scattered formulas, half-remembered theories. If the centuries that followed, people attempted to reconstruct science from these fragments, they still used words like electron, gravity, and mass. They repeated formulas whose meanings they no longer fully understood. They debated theories passionately, but the intellectual framework that once governed or gave these concepts coherence was gone. The language remained, yet the structure behind the language disappeared. The knowledge disappeared. This is the thought experiment of Alasdair MacIntyre, as I mentioned. And in his book, he delivers a punchline, and this is the punchline. MacIntyre argues that this imagined world is not a fantasy. It is a modern moral culture. We still use the language of morality, as I explained in previous podcasts, such as the words justice or rights, dignity, equality. But the shared framework that once made these concepts meaningful has largely collapsed, doesn't exist anymore. But our moral debates continue. But these moral debates often resemble arguments over scientific fragments whose foundation has been forgotten. Essentially, we've forgotten the underlying premises to morality. We can't reconstruct it because it's lost. That's at least MacIntyre's argument. To understand how we arrived here, we must return to a moment in history when Western civilization made a decision. One of the most consequential decisions ever made. This major decision was born not out of optimism, but out of exhaustion. Modernity begins from the position of war, and I will spend some time talking about this. So when we think about the modern political period or the modern political order, we can say it's roughly 16th to the 18th century or so. And during this modern political period, order did not emerge because society suddenly became enlightened. I'll say that again. During the modern political period, order did not emerge because societies became more enlightened. It emerged because people became traumatized. From the 1500s through the mid 1600s, for those if you don't remember, Europe was consumed by religious conflict. More than 150 wars and uprisings were fought over theological disputes. The most devastating war was the 30-Year War. In parts of Central Europe, between 20 and 30% of the population died. There's record that entire regions were totally depopulated. Everybody was killed. In the German states alone, the population fell from roughly 21 million to 13 million or so people. This was not a war of the land. This was not a war over wealth or political power. This was a war about truth. This was a war about God, about salvation. People were willing to kill and die, not for advantage, but for righteousness. And the destruction forced a terrifying question on society. Probably one of the most profound questions within all periods of time throughout society. And the question is this: can a society survive if it requires agreement about ultimate moral truth? Increasingly, early modern thinkers concluded, no, it cannot. Society cannot survive if it does not agree on what is moral truth. And from that answer, modernity was born. There's a few philosophers that we need to talk about as it relates to modernity. The first we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes watched civil war tear England apart. His conclusion was stark. He argued that the greatest danger to civilization was not tyranny, but it was chaos from the wars that were going on at or around this time. The natural condition of humanity, Hobbes argued, is a world where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so Hobbes does something revolutionary, at least at the time. He lowers the goals of politics. Before Hobbes, political philosophy asked questions such as, what is the good life? Political philosophers, politicians, what is a virtue? What is justice? But when Hobbes came on the scene, he changed the question. He asked instead, how do we avoid violent death? He suggested, how can we have peace, but not virtue? Essentially, he was suggesting to us that peace, not virtue, becomes the highest political good. And to achieve this peace, Hobbes proposed something radical. Remove moral authority from heaven is his basic idea. Remove moral authority from heaven and give it to the sovereign, or give it to the political leaders. Right and wrong became whatever the law commands. Essentially, the political leaders should take over the role of moral governor or moral overlord. And with this is a common theme we've seen in all of the podcasts, I heard in all of these podcasts, is that justice becomes compliance. You can't support justice other than the fact that it exists and you should comply with it. Obligation becomes enforcement, talked about that, and the state becomes the ultimate authority. Political theorist Carl Schmitt later describes this shift, and he describes it pretty bluntly. He says all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. The sovereign becomes the earthly replacement for what once belonged to God. Essentially, we're replacing God for a secular ruler, or at least a secular ruler with inside of a republic or a democracy. John Locke, another philosopher, he softens Hobbes. He isn't the same position of Hobbes. Actually, they have substantially different worldviews. But what he says, instead of grounding order in fear, Locke grounds order in consent. And what do we mean by that? Authority no longer flows from a transcendence, but authority now is based upon the consent to the politician or the polity in which we give it. And this flows upward from the individuals. Rights come before duties today in contemporary society. Choice comes before obligation, And with the advent of modernity, religion is not abolished, it's simply privatized. And so faith ultimately becomes something individuals practice personally, but it no longer structures the political order. This shift becomes the foundation of modern liberalism. Philosopher Charles Taylor later describes this transformation as the move from a society grounded in a shared moral cosmos to one built around individual authenticity. Accordingly, we see with our own eyes that the early modern ideas, the early modern settlement worked without question. Religious wars did in fact decline, pluralism became manageable, and political stability increased. And so when we think about modernity, it's not all bad. Actually, most of it is really good. Yet, with all of this stability came with a trade-off. That trade-off is super important as it relates to these podcasts. Society no longer required agreement about truth, only agreement about procedure. Society said procedures with respect to law, rights, and neutrality, and of course, process are the most important things that we should care about. And the sacred and understanding truth is less important. Essentially, truth became dangerous to peace. Because if we're going to argue about what is true or what is false, we're not going to have a neutral stance. And if we don't have a neutral stance, then we can't have agreement on laws, rights, neutrality, or process. So accordingly, at least based upon my view of modernity, neutrality becomes the highest virtue. Sacred authority, the thing that once restrained power, was gradually removed from public life. But when the sacred was gradually removed from public life, something important happened next. The early modern world did not immediately lose its moral order. And this is important to understand because here we are 700 years later, and we're just discovering the major change. The early modern world did not immediately lose its moral order, it inherited one. Modern societies continued living off moral capital accumulated over centuries of religious tradition. Meaning, people still believed in virtues like honesty, sacrifice, duties, and constraint, mainly because they were taught it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Yet, post-modernity, or post the beginning of the modern era, people simply stopped asking the questions of where did our virtues and our morals come from. And for a while, this arrangement worked. There was no problems. But as Nietzsche said, and as we talked multiple times in some of the other podcasts, as he warned, is that when one gives up faith, in his comment, it's Christian faith. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. What this means is that if you no longer believe in faith or something outside of the rationality of God or the sacred, then there is no way to produce a moral foundation that is binding, and everyone will continue to rationalize morality to their own premise. Morality first becomes institutionalized by the state, but then it must become individualized over time. Simply, when we remove the foundation of morality, eventually the structure collapses. And we are clearly seeing that in the United States today. Today we are witnessing, or we can say we are witnessing, statistical consequences related to the end of morality. Here's just a few statistics to think about. In 1994, about 38% of Americans believed moral truth was absolute. Today, that number is 31. Among young adults, nearly 3/4 say morality depends on the situation, and that's not based upon anything objective. Meanwhile, Americans sense the moral drift. Nearly 80% of Americans say the country's moral values are getting worse, yet they cannot agree on what those values actually are. Institutional authority has collapsed as well. In the 1960s, trust in major institutions, government, media, churches, hovered around 60 to 70%. Today, that number hovers below 30%. Trust in Congress, below 15%. Church membership has fallen below 50% for the first time in American history. Family structures have weakened as well. In the 1960s, about 72% of American adults were married. Today, less than 50% are. Births outside of marriage have risen from 5% of the population to approximately 40%. Societal trust has also collapsed, as I mentioned in previous episodes. In the early 1970s, 46% of Americans said that most people can be trusted. Today, that's less than 30%. We also notice that loneliness is rising. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends have quadrupled since the 1990s. These numbers all tell a story. And it tells a story of a society that still believes in moral language, but no longer shares moral authority. Now, there's people who take a totally opposite position to this. Defenders of modern liberalism argue that this moral neutrality that was created in modernity was not a mistake. Some would argue it's an absolute breakthrough, and I would argue too with them that most of what we achieve and obtain from modernity is absolute wonderful windfall for society. But there's downsides, as I already mentioned. But this is the liberal position as they celebrate modernity. The argument is that before modern liberalism, societies often enforced moral conformity. Religious dissent prior to modernity could be punished, minorities could be persecuted. The liberal state, according to them, solved this problem by remaining neutral. The great political philosopher John Rawls argued that modern societies contain many competing moral and religious worldviews. Because citizens can disagree about ultimate truth, according to Rawls, the state should avoid enforcing any vision of the good life. Instead, society should operate through shared procedures. Different moral systems could coexist peacefully through what Rawls called overlapping consensus. From this perspective, neutrality is not weakened. It is the genius of modern democracy, according to Rawls. But this counter-argument, or this argument by Rawls, fails. This argument assumes something historically proven. It assumes that a society can remain stable without a shared moral foundation. History clearly suggests otherwise. Every political order depends on some level of moral consensus. In the last podcast, we talked about the fall of various empires that lost their moral well-being. Shared assumptions or shared beliefs in assumptions to sustain trust, cooperation, and sacrifice are not enough. Without a moral foundation, institutions lose its legitimacy. And we see this in the United States. Politics become a struggle between rival moral tribes. I mean, in today's society, we see this probably more than ever before. We have extreme party division, the left and the right, the woke on the one side, the Tea Party on the other. All symptoms that we are living in a society where morality has broken down. McIntyre warned that modern societies is attempting something unprecedented. McIntyre says that modern society attempted to build a moral order without asking one question: what is the good life? When moral claims, according to McIntyre, lose their foundation, they do not disappear. They become weapons. I'm going to say that again. When moral claims lose their foundation, they do not disappear. They become weapons of the elite, weapons of those in charge. We've clearly moved away from monarchs, priests, imams, rabbis, to a secular governor, one who engages in behavior not necessarily grounded in anything. And so, I guess the question you have to ask, what is better? This brings us to Gotham's inheritance. This is the world that Gotham inherits. It's a world where institutions govern through rules, incentives, compliance, and enforcement. But what none of the early modern philosophers realized, is that when crisis arrives, such as a pandemic, a war, cultural conflict, institutions suddenly need something they cannot easily produce. They need moral authority. So without moral authority, people rely on other tools. Governments rely on other tools. They rely on force. They rely on shame. They rely on emergency powers. This is where the structural weakness lies. This brings us to the question that we now face. For sure, without question, the early modern experiment solved real problems. But while in the process of solving real problems, it created other problems, particularly this one. If peace was purchased by removing sacred authority from public life, what happens when a society suddenly needs moral authority again? What happens when neutrality can no longer hold a fragmented society together? What happens when people still believe, but no longer trust the institutions meant to guide them? This is the question facing the modern world, and it leads directly to the conditions we will explore next. A society where belief remains, but authority collapses. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred.